Welcome back to Copperstar Precision, the channel dedicated to getting you more points at your competitive shooting matches. We're continuing with the Ruger build, and I just wanted to make a quick video on how to find the ideal scope ring height for your scope. So as you know, we're using the Bushnell Match Pro, and we need to find out what size rings we need in terms of height in order to make sure that we do not contact the fore end here. So we're going to need 30 millimeter rings because the tube diameter of this scope is 30 millimeter, but then we have to decide what height we need. And I found the easiest way to do that, there are plenty of scope calculator, ring height calculators and all that stuff online, but it's best just to have the scope in hand and $2 worth of nickels. Go to the bank, get yourself a roll of nickels, and here's what we're going to do. Now, what's important to note is that this is a 30 MOA rail. It has 30 minutes of cant, or about 9 mils of cant built in. So what's actually happening is that this is not level or parallel with the fore end. So this end that is closer to the barrel is actually lower than the back end. So for a worst case scenario, imagine we use this last Picatinny rail slot for our scope ring. We'll start with 5 nickels. I'm using nickels here. You can use anything. Coins are nice because they usually have a pretty uniform thickness. We're going to measure them with a caliper anyway, but let's put that there, and then let's see where we need to lay the other one. And what I'm doing here is I am aligning the scope so that it is as far forward as possible. So the closest the scope rings could go would be here, putting this end of the scope as close to the barrel as possible. And the reason for that is we're probably going to move this scope back towards here, towards the shooter for eye relief. But the challenge is that just in case, worst case scenario, putting the first ring at the front is going to be kind of give us the least clearance. So we're erroring on the side of worst case scenario, having this fully forward. You'll also notice that I have the sunshade attached. That's going to add a little bit of extra length, and because this is tilted downwards, it's going to interfere. So if you want to run a sunshade, or if you want to run scope caps or anything like that, make sure all of that is on the rifle, or on the scope I should say, while you're doing this. So 5 is not going to be enough because I am contacting the back but not in the front. So we'll add another nickel to each pile. And it looks like we're touching, but we're also contacting, I'm using a piece of paper here, we're also contacting the fore end, so it looks like we're going to have to add one more. And when we put it on like this, we're contacting both sets of nickels, and we have cleared the fore end. So now what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to measure with my cheap digital calipers the size of these. Looks like it's 0.519, so let's call it 0.52 inches. That's about 13.17 millimeters, so right around 0.52 inches. Now, I made this little diagram here, and what we just measured is what's considered the saddle height. So it's from the bottom of the ring to what is the bottom of the scope tube, because remember we had the scope tube up like this. So it's just the distance between the top of the Picatinny rail and the scope, bottom of the scope base. So that's this dimension here, and that's usually referred to as the saddle height. A lot of ring manufacturers use this distance, which is from the top of the Picatinny rail to where the rings actually separate from the top and bottom halves. So in order to get this dimension, we're going to have to add half of the scope tube diameter. In this case, it's 30 millimeters, so we're going to have to add 15 millimeters to our scope ring height in order to have adequate clearance at the worst case scenario. Now, like I said, you just have to get close in the worst case scenario, because chances are this scope is not going to be as far forward as what I have depicted here. So just to give you an idea, because this is slanted, if we move this back to here we would actually have to space out our rings differently, and here we should have even more clearance, which we do. So still plenty of clearance there for our scope rings. So I'm going to take those dimensions and I'm going to look at some probably vortex rings. I might go with just the cheap tactical rings for now. How much should you spend on scope rings? What kind of scope rings should you get? Should you get a single piece base, quick release levers, all that good stuff? I'm just going to go with simple 2-piece rings and go with something relatively affordable. They don't have to be super high-end precision machined rings. It obviously helps if you have that in your budget, by all means go for it. But for this rifle, and because it's a 22 and it doesn't have very much recoil, we don't have to worry about the most robust rings in the industry. Obviously something like a spur mount I think is way overkill, considering the mount costs just as much as the rifle. Spur mounts are like $400. This is a $500, $600 rifle, so a little excessive there. So in the next video, we'll be mounting the scope, talking about how to level the scope, and we'll go from there as we continue the Ruger Precision Rimfire rifle build. Thanks for watching, and as always, until I see you next time, score more points.